Boom.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll be fun. Just make sure yeah, no, that's all good.
And this demo I showed you, it's from 2 years ago. So I haven't shown you the new one yet. This is one of the.
I look forward to seeing it.
That's what we have planned. So would it be okay then to share the Zoom link to invite some people? It would be.
Absolutely, yes, it would be. And this whole thing about cards is something that's really on my mind, to be able to manipulate and interact with units of knowledge in a better way is very important, of course. So it's nice to see that work.
Yeah, it's quite nice. It took a while to get to a point. This demo, I mean, we made an MVP pretty fast to test the idea. And then everything that took a long time is creating the backend, integrating, doing all the code. There's a lot of stuff that went behind the scenes, but we're finally getting to a point where people are going to be able to use it, and that's very fun. Oh, and all the cards have a backside to them as well for all the metadata, so that's quite nice.
Yeah, that's very useful. So you flip it over and
exactly.
Yeah. Oh yeah, cheers.
Cheers, coffee and tea.
Yeah, I'm so excited with
that's a different type of coffee, and that's a very nice cup, by the way.
Yeah, it's so cool because you have to pay attention to it. I've been drinking, I've had them for a few years. Suddenly they've become the favorite thing in the whole world. Hi, Gunther.
Nice. Hey, Gunther.
Hello there.
How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. So, how are you doing?
Good. Very well. Rafael and I just talked a little bit about what he's going to be presenting on Friday, which is great. We had a few minutes before the call. So we look forward to him showing his matrix-based liquid space in the terms of our group, to put it in a very, very bad way. So yeah, interesting.
I love the different words people use to describe it.
I'm trying now to fix some typos in the book. And it's actually really, really hard. I had someone very kindly send me a list of a lot of errors, but they were reading them. So that means page numbers don't match up. And there's got to be So just anyway, digital stuff should be a bit different than it is. Okay, while we're waiting, see if anyone else joins us, I just want to tell you, I'm not sure how relevant it is to our chat, to tell you what's been number one on my mind now, and we talked about it in the university group this morning. It's, Mr. Anderson, I was just going to update the guys on one of the issues we talked about this morning, which is, I strongly believe that it should be possible to have a discourse based on documents, just like academia is, but for anybody. And for this to happen, a few things need to be possible. Number one, if I am reading a document and I come across a citation and I happen to have the cited document on my hard drive or cloud or whatever, I should then be able to click to open that document to the right page. I shouldn't have to, and this was what Joey brought up from the university this morning, a hyperlink in academia today is horrible because it usually takes you to a paywall. Even if you have logged in and you have credentials, it's still just a page with a description. You have to click PDF, you have to click download. So it's not really a link in the way we think of a web link. So if you have the document, you should be able to click to and open your local document. That's number one. Number two, these documents, and I'm talking about these documents you have in your directory. For this, I'm not interested in the rest of the world. We're talking about your own personal library. If someone cites something, you should somehow be able to know that. Maybe the document itself changes color or whatever, it doesn't matter. The interactions can always be experimented with, but let's say what we talked about this morning, Mark and I in the group, one of us writes an article on that. I share it with you, Gunther. You comment on that. And then later on, Rafael gets one of two. he should be able to know the thread. So,
Oh, I think I agree, but do you have a new microphone? So I'm having a bit troubles understanding you. So the audio is a bit
Mark and Raphael, did you also
hollow.
have problems hearing me?
Yes, a little bit.
Can I add something to Fred's point? Listening to it played back, because the answer, I mean, starting by saying, yes, I agree. I do want, in terms of notifications, something that I think to consider, so this isn't sort of, like a must have, but possibly scoping the degree of the notification. And why do I say that? Because if I'm writing something, say, within my research group, it'd be interesting there when someone excited. If I'm someone writing something that has far more connections, it's going to be like one of those sort of likes columns on social media, because they're potentially so there is an issue of scale that doesn't argue against the idea, but it's something to be brought in mind. And the other thing is, going back to the first point about the paywalls and the problems they cause, is that I think the way I'd see it is that the aspiration is that it should link. But in doing that, we should probably be mindful that the status quo is that there may be something else in between. And I understand that's most likely to be a paywall. In other words, just considering if there's a way we can ride both horses at once, on the grounds that we can't tell everyone to change how they work. Because I think Fred's point is right. In the ideal world, if we could wave a magic wand and say, just connect, it should. And obviously, if it's your own document, then you totally control things.
Yeah, I mean, that's all I care about, if you have the document already.
Yeah, sure.
Initial context. Because, you look at days of old, all these interesting people sending letters back and forth. We can do that, but we can add magic instead of broken web links.
Mm-hmm.
Or,
well, yes.
or the worst thing in the whole entire world, as far as I'm concerned, in knowledge work, comments at the bottom of a blog post. Oh my God. What a way to write stuff that'll not be read by anyone, right? Anyway, so that was that.
I totally agree with Mark on the point that it sucks for people to learn a new skill if they have been working a certain way for a long time. So it has to be integrated to in their workflow, like additive, and not replace. I think that's very important. And this last weekend, I was thinking about citations, and I kind of noticed that two things related to citations, and it might seem completely obvious mentioning them, but I found it pretty funny either way. So citations are exactly the way that likes works in social media. So if you have like 100 likes, that post has reference. People are looking into that content. And if you have like 100 citations, people mentioned or like your content 100 times because it has been shared or reproduced or in different ways. So the more citations an author has, the more influential he is. It's the same way in social media. So I found that as a pretty interesting combination. And also, the earlier you publish, the higher chance you have of getting more citations, because it takes people time to read the papers and reproduce them and write their own papers, in turn get published. So it's very time consuming over a long period of time. It's very, very slow. So I don't have any like answers or replies to how it could be different, or even if it should be different. It's just some things worth mentioning on how different academia is, but at the same time, how alike it is to social media.
Yeah, there are huge issues surrounding how citations are used to store academic life, to put it that way. Absolutely.
Of course, the problem there is you're looking at raw numbers. What if I write a paper that is extremely influential to Mark Anderson's thinking, then his paper is the one that gets cited 10,000 times because he gets published in a slightly higher profile forum than I'd originally published my paper. I get the one link in from Mark's paper to mine. The other readers of Mark's paper don't bother to follow his links. and all of the fame accrues to him, and I vanish into the dustbin of history.
Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting thing too, that in a way we've got an odd mix now. We've got citations that, you know, in a way we've got a thing that goes back into the days when, you know, a post went by horse or by a man running with a thing in a cleft stick, and then sort of bibliometrics that seem to have come in around the 1950s, and it's an odd mix, and I think it's a really poor mix. And one of the things actually we were discussing this morning in our little research group was, well, I sort of raised the issue again about the meaning of citations. And I think it's very pertinent, the point Peter's just made, because one of the things, you know, if we go back to the scenario he's raised, is that if I was doing that and I genuinely think this paper is extremely important, it would be really useful to have a way to, in a sense, mark that citation. Okay, so it's not, you know, there may be 30 references at the end of the document, but this one is a damn sight more important than me mentioning that Tim Berners-Lee invented the web, you know, because we kind of know that, but if you don't write it, you know, say in the context of this article, someone will shout at you for not putting it in there. So some of these things are just commonplace. They're almost like fillers within an academic context. You put them in there because people will complain if they aren't in there, but they fulfill no useful purpose, because realistically, the sort of person reading this material, frankly, will know that stuff, which I will ought to. So there's all this padding around the edge, and it's annoying because it sort of makes it harder to see the citations that really should stand out, the ones that it should produce. Say, I definitely need to go and read this.
The link that Raphael just put in, oh God, I hate that. No, hang on a second, Edgar's knocking, sorry.
Yeah, I was looking at the books from MIT Press. They have a couple of books on information science, and I found this one this weekend, and it takes a different point of view on information that I found quite interesting. So this book talks about how people talks about basically feelings and connected to information. Sometimes you don't want to know information because it's going to make people feel bad. Sometimes you need to know information because it might save a life. So it directly connects information with feelings, and I found that it's quite nice.
That is interesting, but please click on the link that I put in here.
And also, we're not capturing the polarity of the reference. I might be wanting to cite the work because I think it's a big steaming pile of you-know-what.
Yep.
And he's getting credit as having a lot of people cite it, but the reason that they're citing it is because it's horribly misorganized.
We need link types for sure, at least to say, at least one that says I'm citing this does not mean I support it.
Exactly.
Do not follow.
Yeah.
By the way, that link that I just shared is from 2005. I was interviewed regarding what became liquid by the New York Times. And the tool allows you to do is, you know, select any text and then do over 300 different types of searches on it. And the lady did not understand it at all. She says, I'm reading it starts with the word the, and I spend the next hour looking up etymology, history, and translations of the word the. And it makes me really intellectually angry, that one and the book that you were pointing at, Raphael, because no one ever says, do not, under any circumstances, go out your front door. There's a whole world, you will get lost. You can go anywhere. Right? It's called basic navigation. It's called being in the world. So no such thing as too much information. Just bad tools and bad ways to deal with it. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, it's a bit like, I was finding myself, I found myself looking at Kindle and all these, I somehow must have turned the thing on that shows highlights, which if I'm reading some novel, it doesn't really help. And part of me feels like you spent wasting an afternoon going through and highlighting all the words "the" or something just to see what happens to the system. I guess they turn you off eventually, but I mean, there's such meaningless things you see in there. I sort of that sort of system strikes me as more dross. I just see a thing saying, you know, 2,335 people have underlined that. And I immediately think, Ah, right. So you underlined it because somebody else underlined it. And so we're back in the underpants gnomes, you know. So if I underline enough of these things, maybe I win a prize. But again, because there's no metadata, there's no context surrounding it. So for instance, like Peter's point, I might be highlighting it because I think it's a steaming pile of poo, but I can't indicate that to people. And anyway, you know, if I was doing a negative citation, I want to do it with a little more care, because the aim is not necessarily, the aim I would hope is not an ad hominem attack on the author, but rather than to take issue with their work.
That reminds me of Sturgeon's law, which says that 90% of everything is crap. So I agree with Fro that I don't think there is too much information, because once you apply context, it reduces drastically the amount of information you intake. So, and then if you think that, you know, sure, there's 1 million books, but how many books are on this specific topic? Oh, only 1,000. How many of those 1,000 books are worth reading on that specific topic? You know, it goes down, and then maybe I can only read Japanese, and then it's only 2 books. So that's all I have to work with. So there is not enough information. It's just not organized properly.
Well,
Yeah.
Freud, as a benevolent dictator of author, there's nothing to stop you in your citation panel having some, you know, experimenting with the idea of metadata. In terms of, you know,
how dare you call me benevolent? I'm not benevolent. Seriously.
Well, you know, but in all seriousness, I mean, you know, for instance, something that isn't necessarily applied as a requirement, but you could, for instance, put a sentiment of some, I'm not sure that's a good word, but you could imply something about the link.
Well, this is the great frustration of this community, because I think that is a very good idea, and I will this one time require that everybody submits the manuscript in either Word or author, not PDF or anything else like that, because proofreading is very expensive, and I couldn't afford to have someone do everybody's work before. But there's, okay, I'm getting to the point, sorry. My point is, all these ideas, and then I end up having to be the one to do it. So
No.
Mark, that wasn't a criticism of you at all. I'm so grateful for your actual contributions. But what I mean is, in a case like this, where that is clearly a valuable thing, you know, we have a volume of a book, we do have some control. We can't tell everybody to do everything, of course, and that is not what you're saying. But if we 5 on this call, for instance, work a little bit on, of course, I'm going to put it in visual meta link types for the basic stuff, right? That would be, so there is a beginning to it, because one of my dreams, of course, is that the publication of this, Gunter will have kind of a liquid type space thing where the book will go in and it will be parsed. So every article will be a separate node, and all the references will be parsed within the book, people linking to other articles, to the other book, and everywhere else. And in really cool, early pioneering hypertext ways, not just simple things. And then when someone publishes something new, if it's dumped into this environment, it will intelligently connect, like we're talking about.
Yeah. No, I wasn't, but I should add that I wasn't aiming to sort of spam your to-do list. I was actually thinking quite closely in the context of your sort of PhD work and this thing about the teacher-pupil relationship, you know, as a way of nudging people to, you know, to think more about their, so the fact, yes, you should cite accurately, but also just have some sense of why you're doing it, other than that everyone in the class said, if you don't put more than 30 references in, you'll get dinged, you know, you won't get a good pass. It's just another way, and also it's an opportunity to get around this, to start to get around the problem, saying, well, it's a lovely idea, but how does it actually work?
Yeah.
That's what I meant in terms of your being the benevolent dictator, because there's no one that tells you that couldn't be put within author. I mean, there are all sorts of, I know it's extra work and things, but that was my thinking.
Gunter, I just dumped you in it. Mark gives me a problem, and then I just give you a whole suggestion. How does that fit with how you're thinking about the environment you're thinking about?
It's a very good question. Just let me get a bit organized. Phew, yeah, I think. I mean, this is all relevant. It's highly relevant. I don't know where to start. So there are lots of requirements really, and
I know where to start.
Hmm?
I know where to start.
yeah, priest and then start instead of me.
Yeah, and feel free to cut me off at any time. But
Okay.
one of the things that has to be done at some point, if we're going to do this, is experimentation with the PDF with visual meta going into your environment to see what actually happens and to see what metadata is actually useful. So one of them will, of course, be citation related. You know, what happens if we have too many citations and they go all over the map, literally. So a lot of it is actually just testing on one level. I know that you want to have the foundations really well done, but in terms of knowing what actually works for the user, I mean, just imagine on whatever the launch day is, plus Future of Text next one. You know, we do a big, obviously it'll be on Zoom, presentation video thing, go through the book, and then I move the cursor to the top of the screen, and it has, you know, view as connected document, something like that. And that then takes that PDF, sends it to the server where this system is, parses it live, shows it as one document, and just for effect, you just see it kind of behind it, the page is coming out a little bit, so you know that it's been cut to shreds. And then you have the tools where you can say, okay, show it linearly, you know, show it by keyword thing. Who was citing the same thing? All of that stuff we can start doing. It will be amazing. And we still wouldn't have lost the printed book on the shelf.
And it's nice that it begins to move us away from the sort of cold dead hand of bibliometrics, which is just, you know, in a sense, feeding a fame culture, whilst purporting to sort of, you know, underpin structural science. But I'm not entirely convinced. You know, it's just the best thing we have at the moment, and, you know, pragmatically I say okay, but actually understanding why the links work, you know, why the interrelations work is far more interesting. And actually the link semantics, link types, I think they do matter. I know the sort of beginning of the web rather sheared them off, but it's a conversation again we're having over in the Tinderbox sort of context about some of the views there, that just having lots of lines between things is, you know, about as sophisticated as the average social network diagram. It doesn't really tell you very much, but being able to see strands through it, trails through it, whether they're positive, negative, whatever, or they're on a theme. There are all sorts of ways you can cut it. But these are all important because as much as they're showing, they're eliding things that you don't want to see that make the diagram way too busy to actually see the, you know, the sort of paths you're trying to understand. And it may be you're doing it just to see what isn't there, things you expected to see when you thinned it through, that, you know, that should be there, things that aren't linked into it. Is also a very useful reason for having these sort of linkages.
You know, that brings to mind a thought about how we organize citations themselves. Wouldn't it be nice if we could indicate that these 3 citations should be regarded as a set, you can read any of them in any order, or these 4 items actually represent a sequence that need to be read in that order in order for them to make any sense. So you'd want to be able to, in addition to have the raw site, be able to address a group of sites and identify the group itself as a composite. They could also take part in other composite relationships.
Well, I think that's part of what, I mean, in a sense, that's slightly, I'd agree. And I think it's been slightly hinted at in a way by the conversation earlier about around glossaries and attaching sort of that kind of additional background medium to a document.
So what you're saying now is the difference between a link type and a tag of that document, right? So a link type
Yes.
is purely about the relationship.
Yeah. Well, it might have, well, the link may have data upon it, you know, for instance, that it's just it's standard structural stuff, or there's an argumentation point underlying the citation. What Peter's just mentioned probably might need to be applied as a sort of like a tag placed across the reference items within the sort of visual meta or something.
What I mean is, maybe link type isn't what we're referring to. Maybe what we're talking about is, let's say we need to refer to Mein Kampf. Clearly, you know, an evil piece of work, but scholarship has to be done on it, right? So instead of just something as simple as saying, I'm linking to this, but I don't approve of it, which is almost absurd in its obviousness, unless you're of a certain political persuasion, I guess. But the thing is, what is valuable is for someone to call it influential or fascist or great literature or whatever it is. We're probably talking about tagging, aren't we? You know, for instance, if we refer to Ted's work, we will think of that as being, you know, we would want to, if we could, tag it as being a pioneer, a bit of a rebel, all of that kind of stuff, right? Isn't that what? Because whenever we cite something, it is to deal with an assertion we make, which either that citation is related to or backs up, or we're actually asserting something about that work. You never, ever, ever cite something neutrally, because then it has no meaning. It has to be a point for the citation.
I suppose it's a granularity in. Sorry, I jumped across Raphael. You go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that what I was when I was thinking about citations as well, it feels like even if somebody hasn't done a lot of work on a specific topic, but that somebody uses a lot of citations, that you kind of rub off people's credibility when you keep citing a bunch of things that have credibility. So it's kind of hard, because I personally, I like to have my citations separate, and then just have the text flow better. If I have a better flowing text, and having like a separate document for my citations as a complement to my main text. So I'm completely. I know there's a lot of academic involved in the works that, you know, Freud does, and I think Mark does as well. And I like to come at it from a different perspective. I like to know the references that has been used, especially people's names and important articles or books or documents that they have written, or even presentations. And then have, you know, the main article structured in a way that is better to read, better to consume. So I prefer a more storytelling approach to things with a complementary bibliographical references, citations, and things separately.
You get that more in books, though, don't you? You tend to get a bibliography that's almost separate to the references.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel that citations break the flow of text, because when you take something out of context, so you took a citation from a book, and that citation in that specific spot probably works as a whole. But once you start chipping paragraphs out of different parts of text and adding them to complement what you're saying, it becomes a little bit Frankenstein-like to me,
Well, I mean,
to consume information.
Let's look at the reason citations exist. You know, at the birth of humanism, you know, around 1300, they started having a reverence for the wisdom of the old in order to enlighten their future path. So that's really the key. Before that, citations were just someone being really clever, maybe putting a sentence here and there and expecting someone else erudite to realize it and do a little chuckle, right? Which of course still happens. But the point it has become for students is to show that they have read the work. It's that simple, right? And it's kind of pathetic in that sense, in many meanings of that word. But when you're talking about reading kind of a journal article, yeah, it's really important how they visually are available. They should be as hidden as possible, absolutely. But, you know, as Mark Anderson asked for, and we now have in Reader, if you want to check a citation to see if it's bullshit, misinterpreted, or whatever, you should instantly have access to it. because any barrier to doing that means that the chance of a teacher or a researcher not checking on bullshit, it goes way up. It has to be super instant. So we completely agree on that. But the point is, ideally, what should a citation be? It should be a thread to really show that the assertion you're making, the point you're making, whatever you want to call it, you know the history. So you're not just presenting it as something new. And you're giving the reader an opportunity, if they want to go down that rabbit hole, to see maybe where you learned about it, to follow that. So there are very different reasons for the citations. So how they're placed and how we deal with them, you're absolutely right. It is crucial. But when you're talking about, there's two sets of corpuses here. One is the stuff that you have gotten through friends, colleagues, or just downloaded yourself. And then there's the whole world. The whole world is dealt with through some service like Scholarcy, which I would say they help dealing with vast volumes of information, how it connects together. What we're really talking about here is, to pretend I'm Mark Anderson, I can be very figurative. It's like you take the clay off the shelf and you put the clay on your spinner and you want to make shapes out of it. It is a volume of data. You can always add some other clay if you want to, but it is how you see that shape of knowledge, right? And that's where I think, if the bits know what they are, scholarcy.com, Peter, I can write it later. Then tools like what Gunter is doing for layout they could really let you touch it. And the thing about touching, I only realized today, reading a paper book, we all say it's better. I think one of the main reasons is that you touch the book in a different way and you hold it closer to your head, because when you're reading on let's say a 13-inch laptop like I have here, it is actually better in most terms because it's sharp, it's crisp, it's evenly lit, and it comes with a built-in stand, the monitor. But humans want to use their hands. So if we don't feel like we're doing something with our hands, even though it's knowledge, there's something wrong with it. So that's why to take this knowledge of inherent in documents to allow it to be laid out in the kind of a Gunter space has such amazingly interesting potential.
If I can just pop back to just the thing about sort of tagging versus link types and things for a second. One actually, as you neatly showed, one of the sort of problems becomes that, of course, if you add lots of tags onto a link, it can become a tag soup. And indeed, arguably, that was what killed link types. So Mark Bernstein's comment was, it was when Randy Triggs, in his thesis, proposed 147 different link types. Everyone sort of threw their chirograph pencils in the air and said, that's it, end of link types, because people wouldn't do that. But I think there is time and scope to revisit that. We have more digital affordances. So that there are almost two strands you're capturing in terms of the argumentation here. One is quite narrow, the reason for the linkage, which is almost down to sort of for against reference, if quite small. The other is a sort of wider contextual cluster of information you might want to add to it.
Well, so here, Mark, I'm going to do another plug for Visual Meta because it's becoming the thing we talked about this morning. You interact with the thing. And digitally, the thing is, of course, a copy, so let's not worry about that. But if I'm reading Ted Nelson's PDF edition that you've scanned, computer led, let's say, on the back of that, I may very well tag it with 20 tags. Who cares? But when I then cite that document, those tags should be carried along. Okay, me as the author should choose to hide some of them, maybe, because if I say this is shit, for instance, never say that of Ted's work, because it isn't. But if there are some tags that are not for public consumption, you should be able to block them. But that then becomes automatic tagging of kind of a link type, right?
Yes, no, I'd agree. I suppose I suppose really what I'm saying, that I think that that within the context of a what we might call a link type, that you might want to structure sort of two significant, that there's one sort that is a much smaller and much more controlled vocabulary that fills a slightly different purpose. So there's one that's an argumentation or a sort of contextual marker, what this is doing,
This is the
and the
whole,
other information which lies alongside it. The reason I say that, well, I mean, unless you have a totally controlled vocabulary for the argumentation part, it's hard to parse it out of all the other.
that is the
Neither
whole
is
point.
without import.
That is the whole point, and you are the epitome of this, right? So you, on one side, want everything to be anal, let's put it that way. And on the other side, you're the most flowery guy with language, right? These don't mix. However, if you can give a link type, excuse me, if you can tag a tag,
Mhm.
right? Either your own or others. You know, you tag documents as you read them. And then when you're in this huge cluster space, you can either use your own, like, oh, that tag actually means this. As far as you're concerned, this is a human thing, not an objective universe thing. Oh, this group of tags clearly means that. They're the same. Just drag them on top, boom. You can play with that relationship. As you play with them, you understand the relationship better.
Yeah, no, I honestly, I think we're agreeing, and if there's any,
I know we're agreeing. I just think you're bringing up really important points into this. But I have to say one more thing from this morning that I think the rest of you will really appreciate. Dave Millard talked about, okay, quick context. Academia moving into a digital world has brought along a lot of shit. I shouldn't use that word. A lot of crud, right? Like frail links that can break because of DNS failures or whatever it might be. So what we're trying to do here is to reintroduce digital affordances to a citation-based academic discourse history. And we were then talking about the idea of something Chris Guttridge and Mark and me have been discussing is, if you cite something, the word cite just means bring to the fore. That's all it means, right? It's like that thing over there. You should be able to do that in a multitude of ways. You should just say, give me the yellow book in the corner, or give me the DOI this, or give me the URL, or give me the title this, or what. All of that should be together in the citation package to be used as needed. And the thing to be used as needed, and this is what I think Dave really had an interesting insight, is librarians, not libraries, librarians used to do that. You'd come in and say, I need to find the book. Oh, I think it's written by Mr. Smith, right? They did that function. Oh, yes, it's over there. Or we don't have it. It's on interlibrary loan. Or we can buy it for you. Or it's in this journal, whatever it is, right? So if we think of a software layer as being the librarian, they can do that, right? And if you have the librarian access like an agent type of thing for yourself, that librarian should also be able to deal with link types, right? Let's say I'm reading a book by Marc Antoine, who was a good guy, but we disagree on graph theory deeply. I could then say, links that this guy has made are rubbish, ignore them. Or I can say, when he says something is good, it's bad, whatever it might be. But I'm categorizing what he has made for his things differently than he would. It become that librarian filter, you know what I mean? That in-between stage can be quite powerful.
Very good.
Okay.
You know, this also brings to mind some classic library failures I experienced. Back when I was in law school, there was a new book table that they had in the law library right near the door. And I saw a book on, I'd been flipping through it, and I didn't need it at the time. But a semester later, I wanted to get to that book. So I said, you know, well, last semester, like the second week of last semester, I saw it on the new book table. Well, there was nothing in the library catalog tying when books had been on the new book table to their catalog entries. Well, I remembered that it was an oversized book with the distinct maroon cover. Well, information on the physical appearance of book covers was not incorporated into the library catalog in any way. Well, I knew that it was filled with prologue programs. Well, when we eventually found that book many, many months later, it turns out that the catalog entry for it had no mention of prologue or even the existence of any computer source code being in the book. And there was no way to change the catalog record because they explained, well, no, that service was delegated off to Union Cataloging operation, and they weren't able to make local alterations to the catalog record. The book's title was totally meaningless relative to the content because it was a conference in a city in Italy. So the title was That City in Italy Conference and the year that it took place. Didn't even have law formally in the title, just, the such and such conference, because everybody in that area of law knew that that kind of a conference was happening annually at that location. So we had all these failures in the catalog. And then another classic catalog failure, my local public library had a mimeographed monograph on Egyptian hieroglyphics. Really, truly remarkable texts. And of course, because it was only looked at once in a blue moon, the library had silently thrown it out. So I'm trying to find the book, and I said, well, you discarded this book. I borrowed it last year. They said, well, yes, but at the time, they didn't maintain any library records because they were afraid that if your library patron record included your past borrowing, they could be forced to disgorge it to the FBI if the FBI arrived with a warrant. So in order to protect politically sensitive things, they purged all of the past library records to make sure if the record doesn't exist, we're not violating the court order when we don't hand over the record, which is wonderful, except that for my research purposes, I would have been more than happy to say, please retain my borrowing history, because I'm not looking at anything even remotely political. I couldn't care less. Frankly, I would like the world to be able to know what I'm borrowing, because I think my borrowing habits might be of use to other scholars interested in this area. And the idea, augmenting the library catalog, was just anathema to the librarians. And final case in point, we had a cookbook of colonial recipes. And one of the things that the cookbook called for were some recipes using some herbs, which are now known to potentially cause miscarriages if you consume them when you're pregnant. So rather than trying to augment the catalog record or physically staple an addenda to the front page of the book, it says, whatever you do, don't make the recipe on page 47, because if you're pregnant, you could lose your baby. They decided instead they'd throw out the book. So all of the other recipes, which were perfectly innocuous and harmless, were lost all time.
Exactly.
With no records, of course, being made of any of these discarded items, because once it's not in the collection, who cares?
Yeah.
Now we just depend on archive.org to archive the whole web to make sure we don't lose anything.
Well, it is interesting too that, funnily enough, that I mean, it's interesting hearing Peter's comments, because one of the things I was reflecting on this morning in our research group was the fact that when I was for my thesis work, I was trying to figure out, it seemed odd, like in looking at librarian stuff, I could find sort of digital librarianship, but that seemed to be about having basic, better electronic card catalogs. It wasn't about exactly the sort of thing that Peter's just mentioned. And it seemed to stem from a rather interesting thing. I didn't find this written down, but the sort of feeling I got from it is that until it stopped moving, in other words, until it's been pinned to a door or bound between two bits of card, they don't want to play with it. And it was interesting because I was also talking, well, how do you, if I give you a digital archive, a hypertext, for instance, what do you do with it? And you could see them sort of itching to say, well, why don't we print it out on paper? Brackets, because we know what paper is.
Well, Mark, you've highlighted the issue that a reference library database is the same as a library database, card index. And the actual items aren't what we interact with in either place. The library only cares about a book when you check it out and when you check it in. Other than that, it's only about the card catalog. And that's kind of interesting. But Gunther, what do you think?
Well, these are all very interesting points. So I have to think about them, and these are lots of requirements, really. So it's a challenge, I guess. But I'll figure something out eventually.
What would be very interesting in terms of requirements and testing, Gunther, would be, so the system watches a folder on the user's drive, and the user can either apply a tag through whatever app, and it's saved in that document, preferably Visual Meta, obviously. The web system keeps checking, and if it sees an added tag, it appends that to the visualization. And similarly, the user should be able to add a tag in the web environment, which is then also written to the PDF. So you could then choose where you're doing it from. And there are so many implications here, because one of the primary things I look forward to interacting with is, what's the dots on the screen? Is it the tags or is it the documents? Of course, it could be both, but it gets messy. How do you toggle between the two of them? Et cetera, et cetera. You know, visualization diagrams are done all over the place, and they're all very exciting. So the challenge is to make it very fast, very interactive, and maybe even useful.
Useful would be good, yes. Well, of course, you see that there are several challenges. So first of all, many aspects that need to be kept separate. So of course, I mean, what you really want is a general artificial intelligence, but at the moment, I'm not in the position to deliver that. But of course, we have the whole area of augmentation. Then we have link types. We have the interactions. Then there are accessibility, of course, problems. There are most a large problem are, of course, the logistics, which means that, of course, there are thousands and thousands of visualizations, interactions that you can come up with. But the key challenge is that if somebody comes up with better means to view your whatever your inquiry, then of course there need to be mechanisms for delivery. Want to have one coherent workspace, so it wouldn't be great to have many web pages, and of course, if you want to have desktop applications, well, that's a different matter. So there's a whole lot of choice technologies that is also involved. Then, of course, we have to think about the fundamental issue that if we are talking about link type, citations, assertions, analysis of citation networks, personal preferences, so there's a whole lot of affordances that you want to have. Eventually, you also have to deal with variations in lots of data formats in descriptions. So I mean, what you're doing with augmented with visual meta is to at least, okay, you should be able to read the annotation at, say, the end of a PDF document, which is great if you actually have visual meta aware readers. But then, of course, there's only so much that you can put into specific format, and it really depends, of course, what you want to do. So if you have a very it depends on your workflow. So for hierarchical workflows, you might want to use trees. Then perhaps you want to use networks, the spatial hypertext systems that just care about the position of elements. Then there's always, you might have information with semi-structured content and so forth. And there's really no agreement. So other people like Yuri, they like to work with REF, which is also fine, I guess. So a key challenge is that, which is somewhat related to what Raphael said in the very beginning, is that so if you don't want to force people into something completely new. So the question is how you can make your changes additive. And I mean, yes, these are all huge problems. And what I'm talking about is a large-scale network of which needs to have several aspects in place. Because if you say, well, I don't know, I only want, so I'm reading a paper and I'm following the links, and but I don't want to see, for instance, the links by some other researcher who I think is totally nuts and And so this is not relevant to me. Might be more sophisticated queries. It's very difficult then to, if you have all these requirements and wishes to, so it can't be the way that you have one user interface that simply won't work. But instead, you also need some means of collaboration in place, which means that if you say I need specific information, which for various reasons is not handled by any one of the capabilities or tools that are at your disposal, it at least needs to be possible for somebody else, and I mean the human collaboration to shape the information in whatever way you want it. So it's not only about agents or other computational entities that do some organizational work for you. It's also a question of how you can interface with somebody who is not who is just another human being. And yeah, I mean that's this many intertwined aspects. And so I guess I find this useful because I found it useful that Mark said that there are about, I don't know, 127 link types that somebody came up with in his thesis. And of course, you can invent infinitely many link types. Really depends on what you want to do. And so, of course, such a system. So the point is that there needs to be a considerable degree of flexibility involved to at least deal with all these different kinds of representations and other features that you want to have. So it's really a question how to tie everything together, which is a bit that's really a challenge. So I can't tell you more. It would be great if we actually had an office, but we don't have an office. So that's
the thing is, you said so many useful things there. One of them was about what it should actually do. And it's very easy to sit here and have all kinds of ideas. You're absolutely right. So there are at least two parts to this to see if we can find the most useful thing. One is when you publish a document, you want it to be readable. So you may not do this for every journal, but you may do it for a book, like the way we talked about our massive volume together. And then there is when you're reading stuff, when you're tagging documents in your own world. So if it's just to do a demo, that we all agree that would be kind of useless. So what do we feel here is the thing that we want to augment? Do we want to augment reading what we have downloaded, or finding new stuff, or when we're about to cite, or what is it you guys want to do it?
Well, one thing that came to me listening to Gunther just now is I wonder if it's partly the problem of trying to just ingest too much into the problem space. Yeah. So even before building the tool, just trying to build too big a tool and suffering the problem of premature formalization, because a point again made by Dave Millard this morning was, when viewing something from a sort of computer science perspective, there is a necessity to have some hard edges to things. And some of the ideas we're talking about are still a bit fuzzy. And it seems to me a useful thing to be able to test is to take a smaller scoped set of data. So perhaps more than a personal level, perhaps, the level of a work group or a research group, something like that. Because apart from anything else, then the data should be intimate enough that the people who, might then interact with early testing will have some sense of whether they're seeing the right thing or not. Because if I just dump the whole of the world's knowledge in front of me, I'm probably unskilled enough to know what's right and what's wrong. Yeah. And the tools that we're trying to develop aren't clever enough to help us with that yet. And that's the march we're making. So perhaps a way to do this is to look at some data in a smaller level, a smaller scale, acknowledging that that's not really the end point, but just doing it so that the data you have at hand is understandable to any initial tester. And then you can play around with the uncertainty. So, well, what do I want to see and what can't I see? And that will then sort of inform back onto the data structures or the procedures you might want to use. It may be, for instance, that by doing such tests, we find that our current formats aren't unsuitable or need augmentation, or they need restructuring a different way to deliver the information we want, structured in the way we need it, and in a usable form and at a usable speed and all that sort of thing, when you move to scale. I think that
just something even simpler than that, Mark, before you jump in, Peter, is I think a very good test space is quite simply your own personal library, right? As you learn something to write a paper for a PhD or learn something in a school or whatever it might be, you are going to get more and more PDFs in a directory, and you're going to get PDFs you don't like. So first you need a way to just say, I don't like this, just in the future, remind me not to download it. But also to make that space like you would do in Roman, Notion or whatever, just the ones you have. That in itself, I think, is really, really important. So if we market the idea to ourselves as organize your own library, just that, or get to grips with your own library. Sorry, Peter, for jumping in. You had your hand up.
Yeah, I also have sort of an ethical citation dilemma, and it's prompted a couple times. I asked a whole bunch of people, and no one's ever given me a good answer. And this is the problem of what do you do if you're relying on something you saw years before from memory? So you don't have an actual citation, but I do know with a very high probability that I saw a paper and I can describe some gist of the paper, but I can't find the actual title. I don't know who wrote it. I know that it was maybe a general ballpark time frame in like early 90s. I remember seeing a paper that made this point. I don't want to be accused of plagiarism if I make the point again. And I don't want to be barred from addressing the point because I can't find the citation. So I know that I'm not the original source of the idea. But because I can't find the official canonical source of the idea or a secondary source that mentions the idea so that I can palm off finding the original source onto their ethical obligations, am I forever barred from using the idea? And shouldn't we have some mechanism where we could say, you know, hello world, I don't have a complete site for this. Here's what I know. If you reading this digital document can fill in the blanks, you know, just automatically use the platform.
What about simply being able to cite unknown or unremembered?
Sorry, but Frode, didn't you already give the answer to this question? I don't know when, but
yeah, of course I did. Yeah, I just forgot. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. We don't know when exactly.
No, but you said when you make a citation, it's not just a citation. You can think of it as an assertion, and that means that you could, for instance, associate a confidence to it. So if I have a citation, I could say, well, let's say, I don't know, a fuzzy assertion, and I'm not really confident in whether the citation is correct. But at least, you would be able to actually, you could even filter out the fuzzy citations, or even somebody else I could review Peter's work and then look at all the fuzzy citations and then do new assertions, say, well, okay, here are the corrections. And I guess that's also why you need at least higher order links in such a system, or being able to say something about links
to abstractions, kind of.
And also in law, we have sort of an analogical issue under hearsay, the issue of, are you offering the statement for the truth of the matter, or are you trying to assert that the statement was made? For another example, at an ACM conference some time back, I don't remember the exact time frame, I remember having had an informal conversation with someone mentioning to them the work on the Programmer's Apprentice project and being told that the researchers who were working on that went on to do something related to military robotics. And it would be useful to be able to put that out there. But again, I don't know who, I don't know when. What I'd like simply to be able to do is make the assertion that at some point in the past, and I'm not sure exactly where, I know it's an ACM conference that occurred at, someone had told me this assertion. For the value of it, I want to assert that that happened, even though, again, we don't have any more concrete data than that. That partial information might enable someone else to be able to make a connection they couldn't make otherwise, and it doesn't fit in the context of our formal citation network.
Yeah, but that's the thing. I think very, very strongly that citations are not just useful. They are also a noose around our necks. I hate them. You know, I come from an arts background. To have to, you know, back up every single gosh darn thing I say, I think it's really annoying. You know, when something is truly important, you really want to highlight it, do it. But this whole, oh, you must have 200 citations, right? I think is ridiculous. So I think dealing with the immediate things you're talking about, Peter, is just writing it in prose, saying, at a conference so-and-so, I remember blah, blah, blah. If that's what you got, that's what you got. You know, you're not, of course, in law, you have very specific rules. And of course, if you're a young student, there are very specific things. But if you're submitting to a journal or an academic community, you know, there should be some level of accepting that. Like a lot of the stuff that I will say about Doug was in dialogue, you know. I have an email here and there, but that's it. We shouldn't be too tied down to how we tie things together. Oh, that's a great thing.
But I tested, I mean, because it wasn't until my final Viva that people stopped saying, why on earth are you talking about this? No one, you know, no one else says there's this problem. And then having agreed there was one, so, well, why don't you write a better narrative about it? So yeah, no, it's hard sometimes, especially when there isn't, whether it's because there's no prior art, or as Peter's saying, it's, you know, there's unclear or imperfect recollection, or maybe the record's been lost, you know, so, you know, especially after something like a conflict and a library's burnt down, and that the only copy, you know, the only master copy of something of an artifact has been destroyed or something. So I like the thought of, well, this is where the sort of, you know, a network of metadata comes in, the ability to basically, in essence, put your shoulder behind something, so you come across something that's imperfect or incorrect, and you can offer an assertion to support it.
I think
because I don't want my scholarship dinged or to be accused of trying to trade on someone else's thought. I want to explicitly say, you know, this isn't my thought. I know I saw it somewhere, but
but so
this is as much as I have to go by at this stage.
So in kind of closing, I think we have Peter over here and we have Raphael over here, right? Peter saying everything has to be cited, otherwise it look like poor scholarship. And Raphael saying, can I please read the damn document? Don't put too much junk in there, right? That's what we're dealing with. So I think the environment that we're talking about building is one that achieves both. And I think that can be done by, we're thinking about one person, a student sitting down at their little laptop, they're writing a paper, and view definitely comes into it. They're writing a paper and they're saying something and they feel they need a bit of a backup. So the question becomes how to find a citation based on what you already have read or at least skimmed. That's a very, very powerful use case, I think. That's partly what I'm having problems with now. My library, digital library, is a complete mess, right? But if I'm allowed to add some meta while I work, while I read, just naturally tagging this or highlighting that or whatever, and then be able to view that in different ways, as me, as an individual student, yeah, of course, it was that reddish book with the code in it that Peter was talking about earlier. That can then happen. You know, especially if it's within one's own library. I think when it comes to digital, we have a problem defining boundaries. And there are boundaries. There are things you own and things you don't own, things you've looked at and things you haven't looked at. You don't have to have the whole digital knowledge universe in one basket, right? Yeah,
I think there's a sort of slightly unintentionally lazy supposition that having more is somehow good. And actually, sometimes more means too much.
Having more is very expensive. You know, everything you choose to add to your space takes an infrastructure, in your brain as well as in your hard drive.
Actually, seeing Raphael mention nodes, views in the chat, I don't know if anyone here, I've been trying to sort of dig up some early referencing on sort of multiple views. And it seems to be another thing, a bit like early digital text that's just there, but no one really wrote about it. I feel I have to be wrong, but I just don't know where it is.
The only good stuff I found is authorship provisions and augments.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's the one place I sort of I know, but it wasn't until I was talking. In fact, funny, I was trying to explain to someone about a Tinderbox, which sort of has multiple views that are in there, and trying to explain to someone who didn't really understand what views were, and it was a bit sort of.
Sorry, the thing, Mark, that is non-obvious, I think it is probably obvious to you, but just for clarification, the stuff that is described in there isn't just view A should look like this, view B should look like that.
No.
It is very much the mechanisms through which the views can be enabled, which is of course very relevant to what we've been talking about, right? It's you know, you should be able to execute a filter, which is what he called it, rather than a query or something, to view certain things in certain ways. And I think this is where Gunter is stuck, because Gunter has gone through so many different ways of making things become available for the user. That the iterations of how that can become problematic is kind of overwhelming. So I hope, Gunter, in these discussions, whether you agree with everything we say or not is secondary, but at least helping you scope down to the kind of stuff, right? Because if we just talk about views in the most powerful, loosest sense, there's nothing. I mean, the very first meeting I had with Doug Engelbart in his office, you know, he talked about his world and I was electrified, but literally electricity in my bones. And he asked me about my philosophy. And I remember what I said, and this is what I felt. My work, my aim is to make information more liquid, but not completely liquid, because then it is useless. You know, the boundary issues.
No, it's interesting his thing of sort of views and filters, because the sort of the mental picture I have with views is almost, it's a bit like one sitting there at one's desk, sort of trying to put something together, and someone might walk past, lean over your shoulder, say, you know, if you turn that up the other way, it'll all fit together, and it does. And it's having, you know, views to me is that sort of affordance with information.
I kind of feel when we have discussions like this, I always think about the difference in what one generation, like for example, last generation's problems, we solved some of it, and then our generation's problem is going to be only for the next generation to use, right? So there's this kind of transition period that happens between solving problems and using solutions that are kind of tricky. There's always going to be frustration and things that take a long time to solve, especially when it comes to standards and the web and don't even get me started in academia. Like it's so slow. So I think, for example, of Minority Report and all of those interactive screens they use, like I want to have this document and I would love to get more information of what's being said, and I see somebody's name and that person's picture, and maybe that person wrote a couple of books, and I can see the books and I can open the books, and it's all in one environment that you can explore and dive into. But it's tricky because things have to be integrated, and how are they going to be integrated if you have a fractured ecosystem of apps and standards and all these things? It's madness.
Can someone tell this guy visual meta?
I was also thinking of you know, McLuhan's rear view thinking, because we do a lot of that.
Rear view meta, yeah.
It'll take a while for visual meta to be everywhere.
It needs some rebranding though. Maybe we should call it them visual meta. Visual meta sounds so nerdy and it's likely wrong. But yeah.
What was that other one? Somebody mentioned last week, I think.
Oh, that was probably me saying permadata, which was a bit tongue in cheek, you know. Yeah. If you liked it that much, you should have put some metadata on it, you know.
Well, considering it's supposed to be a new web, why don't we call it Silk? That was a joke for the record, for anyone who may be tuning in late. Right,
I
guys,
think I understood.
gone a bit over today. I hope that it's cool with everyone. Very grateful for these discussions.
And it's
On
been
Friday-
another cheap session too. Only one book.
No, that was 2 books. That was not cheap. Not for me anyway. On Friday, Raphael will demonstrate a different way of having a large presentation and thinking space. Very much look forward to that. So he will invite some other people. Peter, Gunter, Mark, if you have someone else you think should be here for that session, feel free, obviously. Anything else before we hang up our windows, our little windows like this? They should go away, shouldn't they? All right, I'm going to go to the
Like
playground.
tears in the rain, yes.
Apparently there are live lizards in the playground, so I have to go check those out.
All
Ah,
right, everyone. Cheers.
Take care.
Okay, have a good week, everybody. See you
See you
Friday.
on Friday. Bye-bye.
See you Friday.
lizard overlords have arrived, obviously.